All right, so in this video, we'll be looking at the notes on midpoint formula. This is the warm-up for that lesson. If you will, try to work out these problems. You will definitely see these problems again. With problem number 2, they give you a triangle with the given vertices. Remember, that just means corner points. Make sure you draw this figure on an XY coordinate plane, and then determine what type of triangle it is. If you will, this is the intro question. I'll let you read through this yourselves, and this is the actual exit ticket. So I need you to answer this question at the end of the lesson. From here, we start the notes on midpoint formula, and it says the point halfway between the endpoints of a line segment is called the midpoint. We know that a midpoint is going to divide our line segment into 2 congruent parts. If we have a picture of that, consider the line segment AP. We know that the midpoint would divide this line segment into 2 congruent parts. This will be our midpoint, and we're going to abbreviate it as MIDPT. And we know that the midpoint is an ordered pair. It has an X and a Y value. Notice here they give you the formula for the midpoint. So keep in mind that all formulas for this course you have to commit to memory. We know that the midpoint formula is simply an ordered pair. So it's given us an ordered pair. And the X value is the average of the X coordinates. The Y value is the average of those Y coordinates. So we have our formula. Let's look at our first example. If we look at example 1, they say find the midpoint between the 2 given points. The first step is to label the points. So I know that this is X sub 1, Y sub 1 because it's the first point. Here's my X sub 2, Y sub 2. From here, they want you to apply the midpoint formula. So let's go ahead and write our formula on the page. So my midpoint, again, is an ordered pair, and it's the average of those X coordinates, and then the average of my Y coordinates. So I label my points, I wrote my formula. From here, we can substitute in our values. So we know our midpoint is going to be equal to, and when I substitute in my values, my X sub 1 is a -1 plus my X sub 2, which is 3, divided by 2. And then my Y sub 1 is 2 plus my Y sub 2, which is a -6, divided by 2. From here, we simply need to simplify. So a -1 plus 3 gives me 2 over 2. So that's my X value. And then 2 plus a -6 gives me a -4 over 2. And then, of course, I just need to simplify. So in this case, my midpoint is going to be the ordered pair. 2 over 2 simply gives me 1, and then -4 divided by 2 gives me a -2. And this is my answer. This is the midpoint of that line segment. If we move on to example 2, if I can get there. Notice you guys have a set of checkpoints. Go ahead and work out those checkpoints. And then we move on to example 2. If we look at example 2, they're telling us to find the value of P so that the given point, this -2, 2.5, is the midpoint of our line segment between these 2 endpoints. Now keep in mind, I always want you to draw a picture of what they're talking about. So here's my line segment, and they're telling me the endpoints of this line segment are at P2 And that other endpoint is at negative 1, 3. They're telling me that the midpoint of this line segment is the point negative 2, 2.5. So in this problem, they're already giving me the midpoint. So again, I want to label my points. I know this is my x sub 1, y sub 1, because it's the first point. And this is my x sub 2, y sub 2, because it's the second point. And again, I write my formula. My midpoint is going to be equal to the average of the x coordinates and then my y value is the average of the y coordinates. From here, we want to substitute in our values. So in place of the midpoint, I'm going to write what they gave me, which is a negative 2, 2.5. This is equal to our midpoint, and we'll write in our values. So x sub 1, we know in this case is p, plus our x sub 2, which is a negative 1 divided by 2. From here, I have y sub 1, which is 2, plus my y sub 2, which is 3 divided by 2. So I plugged in my values, and here I want you to label. We know that our midpoint is an ordered pair. It has an x and a y. For the work, we know that this represents our x value, and this represents our y value. So in this case, we simply want to match them up. So I want to match up my x's with my x's and my y's with my y's. So when I do that, my x values have a p plus negative 1 divided by 2. I know it's going to be equal to whatever the x value is in my answer, which is a negative 2. The same thing with the y values. I have 2 plus 3 divided by 2 is going to be equal to whatever I have in my answer for that y value, which is 2.5. So here, if we simplify, I'm going to move this out of the way really quick. If we simplify our y value, we would have the 2 plus 3, which is 5 over 2, and this has to be equal to 2.5, which we know is so. From here, we need to simplify our x value. In order to do that, we have to get rid of this fraction. So I know I want to multiply both sides by this 2. So I multiply both sides by 2. The 2's cancel out. I have p plus a negative 1 is equal to a negative 4. So negative 2 times 2 is negative 4. From here, if I'm solving for p, I need to get rid of that negative 1. So I use the inverse and add 1 to both sides. Therefore, p is equal to a negative 3. So here, if we look at our figure, which we've drawn, we know that in place of that p, we want to write negative 3, because that's what we came up with. So if we check to see if that's correct, notice that if I plug that back into the midpoint, I'm adding my x values and dividing by 2. So I have a negative 3 plus a negative 1 gives me a negative 4. If I divide it by 2, I end up with that negative 2 in the answer. So do a quick check to make sure your answer makes sense. And this is example 2. In the notes, you guys should have a checkpoint. This is the checkpoint for example 2. Pause the video and try to work this out, and we'll move on to the last example. This is example 3. I'm going to need a little bit of space here. If we look at example 3, it says given the midpoint and the other endpoint of a line segment, find the other endpoint. And it says hint. We're going to use this x sub 2, y sub 2 as the other endpoint. Because see, the other endpoint is not given. We're going to substitute in this x sub 2, y sub 2 because it's the other point. So remember, we always draw a picture. So here's my line segment. And let's plug in what they gave us. They gave us one of those endpoints. And it's at negative 1, 9. They also gave us the midpoint, and it's at -9, -10. So I have an endpoint and I have a midpoint. What I don't have is that other endpoint, and they want us to use this in place of it. So x sub 2, y sub 2, because it's the other point. They tell us to go ahead and label our points. So if I label my points, I know that this is my x sub 1, y sub 1, because it's the first point. And let's go ahead and write our formula. The midpoint, in this case, is going to be equal to the average of those x coordinates divided by 2, and the average of your y coordinates divided by 2. So I have my formula. From here, I want to plug in what I know. I know the midpoint is at -9, -10. So I have my midpoint. This is going to be equal to, and we have to plug in the information for the work. So we have x sub 1, in this case, is -1, plus my x sub 2, because I don't know the x sub 2, right? That's my x values. And then my y values, my y sub 1 is 9, plus y sub 2, because I don't know that value, divided by 2. Keep in mind we want to label. This is the x and the y of my answer for the midpoint, right? This is the x and this is the y for the work. All right, so now that we have our information plugged in, we can go ahead and line up our x values with the x value in the answer and our y value with the y value in the answer. So let's go ahead and split our screen up and extend it out. So for my x values, I have -1 plus x sub 2 divided by 2 is going to be equal to the x value in my answer, which is -9. Over here for my y values, I have 9 plus y sub 2 divided by 2 is going to be equal to whatever the y value was in my answer, which was a -10. From here, I need to simplify both sides. So of course I need to get rid of the fraction. I multiply both sides by 2. The 2's cancel out. I have a -1 plus x sub 2 is equal to a -18. And I need to get rid of that 1, so I'm going to add 1 to both sides. I have x sub 2 is equal to a -17. So I have my x value. Now I need my y value. And again, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the 2, so I multiply by 2 on both sides. The 2's cancel out, so I have 9 plus y sub 2 is equal to a -20. In this case, I need to get rid of the 9, so I use the inverse. I subtract 9 from both sides, and I get y sub 2 is equal to a -29. And here, I can write my answer as an ordered pair. Remember, the midpoint is an ordered pair. It has an x and a y value. My x value is a -17, and my y value is a -29. When I go back up to my picture, we know in this case that we found this other endpoint. This other endpoint was a -17, -29. And of course, to do your check, you simply use the midpoint formula. Add your -1 plus that -17 and divide by 2. So I add them together, I get a -18. Divide by 2, notice I get that -9. Do the same thing with your y values to do your check. And this is the end of example 3. All right, so you guys should have an additional checkpoint. If you will, go ahead and work out this checkpoint and see what you come up with. This is the classwork for this assignment, and this classwork is already posted on Modo, so if you don't have it, make sure you go ahead and pull that assignment off.